I'm Thomas Callahan, 67 years old, and this is the story of how my son-in-law learned that calling an Air Force colonel who commanded combat operations and managed billion-dollar air campaigns just a pilot is the kind of mistake that costs you everything. Especially when that colonel spent 28 years not just flying aircraft, but planning strategic operations, commanding air bases, and understanding aviation safety regulations better than most civilian airline executives ever will. 5 weeks after we buried my daughter Jennifer, my son-in-law Marcus Webb called an emergency board meeting of SkyBridge Aviation, the regional airline company we'd founded together 10 years ago. He stood at the head of the conference table in his expensive suit, surrounded by the 3 outside investors he'd brought into the company over the past 2 years, and announced that it was time for a leadership transition. The company needed modern management with contemporary business education to compete in today's aviation market. He said, "I was 67 years old," he continued, "and while everyone appreciated my contributions as a founder and my experience as a pilot, the industry had evolved beyond what my generation understood. It was time for me to step down from the board and transition to an advisory role, allowing younger leadership to guide the company forward." Before I tell you how Marcus learned the difference between someone who flies planes and someone who commands multi-billion-dollar air operations, I need you to do something. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been dismissed because someone thought your military experience was just following orders or doing a single technical job, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why military command experience is something civilians underestimate at their extreme peril. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone reduced your complex career to a single simple job title. Your stories matter, and I read every one. Marcus continued his presentation with slides showing SkyBridge's financial performance and growth projections. He explained that the company needed leadership that understood modern airline economics, digital booking systems, fleet optimization algorithms, and social media marketing. Those weren't things my generation of pilots had trained for, he said with barely concealed condescension. The airline industry had moved beyond the stick and rudder skills I'd learned in the Air Force. What mattered now was business acumen, financial management, and strategic vision, areas where Marcus claimed his MBA from Wharton and his 10 years in aviation consulting gave him superior expertise. The 3 outside investors nodded along as Marcus spoke. They were venture capital people who'd put money into SkyBridge 2 years ago when Marcus convinced them the company had major growth potential. They didn't know anything about aviation operations, but they understood spreadsheets and profit projections. Marcus had been feeding them carefully constructed financial reports that made the company look more successful than it actually was, and they believed him because he spoke their language of business metrics and market positioning. Marcus proposed that I sell my 40% ownership stake in SkyBridge to a combination of him and the outside investors. He'd had the company professionally valued, he said, and based on current assets and projected revenue, my share was worth approximately $3.2 million. He was offering $3 million, which he characterized as generous given the company's need for capital investment. The payment would be structured over 5 years, he explained, giving me a comfortable retirement income while allowing the company to manage cash flow efficiently. I sat at the conference table and said nothing, which seemed to make Marcus more confident. He interpreted my silence as the confusion of an old pilot who didn't understand complex business negotiations. He pulled out documents his attorney had prepared, purchase agreements, transfer paperwork, non-compete clauses that would prevent me from involvement in any aviation business for 10 years. He slid them across the table and told me to take a few days to review them with an attorney if I wanted, but he needed my decision within a week because the investors were ready to move forward with the capital restructuring. Then Marcus said something that revealed exactly how little he understood about my actual background and capabilities. He said he knew this might be difficult for me emotionally because flying had been my whole identity. He understood that pilots often struggled with retirement because their self-worth was tied up in being at the controls of an aircraft. But I needed to accept that my flying days were behind me and that running an airline required skills I'd never developed. He was trying to help me make a graceful exit before my limitations became obvious to everyone. Just a pilot. That's what Marcus thought I was. Some old guy who'd spent 28 years in the Air Force flying planes, then retired and helped start a small regional airline because I couldn't let go of being in a cockpit. Someone whose value to SkyBridge had been his initial capital investment and maybe some basic aviation knowledge, but who was now obsolete in the modern airline business. Here's what Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about or investigate because he'd been so certain of his own superior business education and my limited role as just a pilot. Marcus didn't know that I hadn't been just a pilot in the Air Force. Yes, I'd been a pilot. I had over 6,000 flight hours in everything from fighters to cargo aircraft to command and control planes. But I'd also been a commander and a strategic planner who'd managed operations worth billions of dollars and involved thousands of personnel. Marcus didn't know that after my first 10 years as an operational pilot, I'd been selected for command track and had commanded a fighter squadron, then an operations group, then an entire air base with over 5,000 personnel and an operating budget exceeding $2 billion annually. I'd been responsible not just for flying missions, but for planning air campaigns, managing complex logistics, ensuring safety compliance, coordinating with civilian aviation authorities, and making decisions where mistakes could cost lives and billions in equipment. Marcus didn't know that I'd completed Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, and Air War College, the Air Force's professional military education system that taught strategic thinking, operational planning, and organizational leadership. I'd also completed an executive business program at Harvard Business School specifically designed for military officers transitioning to senior leadership roles. My military education in strategy, operations, and leadership was more comprehensive than his MBA, but he'd never asked about it because he assumed military training was just technical skills and following orders. Marcus didn't know that I'd served as director of operations for a major command headquarters, where I'd planned and coordinated air operations across entire theaters involving hundreds of aircraft and thousands of personnel. I'd briefed generals and members of Congress on operational plans and resource requirements. I'd managed crisis response operations where split-second decisions affected international relations and cost calculations ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus didn't know that I'd spent 3 years working at the Pentagon and Air Force headquarters, where I'd been involved in budget planning, acquisition decisions, and policy development for aviation programs. I'd learned how the military aviation bureaucracy worked, how safety regulations were developed, how oversight agencies functioned, and how to navigate complex regulatory environments. That knowledge was directly applicable to civilian aviation, but Marcus had never thought to ask about my Pentagon experience because he assumed desk jobs were where old pilots went to fade away. Most importantly, Marcus didn't know that I'd retired as a full colonel, an 06 in military rank structure, which meant I'd been selected through multiple competitive promotion boards as someone with exceptional leadership and management capabilities. The Air Force doesn't make you a colonel because you're a good pilot. They make you a colonel because you've demonstrated the ability to command large organizations, manage complex operations, make sound decisions under pressure, and lead thousands of people effectively. When Jennifer and I had founded SkyBridge Aviation 10 years ago, I provided 60% of the initial capital, $2 million from my military retirement savings and investments I'd built over 28 years of service. Marcus had provided the other 40% and had taken the role of CEO, while I'd structured my role as chairman of the board and chief safety officer. I'd let Marcus run the day-to-day business operations because he'd seemed competent and eager, and because Jennifer had loved him and wanted to build something with her husband. But I'd never been passive in SkyBridge's operations. I'd structured the company's safety protocols using principles I'd learned from military aviation. I designed the pilot training program, drawing on Air Force instruction methods. I'd established maintenance standards that exceeded FAA minimums because I'd seen what happened when organizations cut corners on safety. I'd built relationships with FAA inspectors and NTSB officials from my military days working with civilian aviation authorities. And I'd maintained my own commercial pilot licenses and type ratings, flying regularly to stay current and to understand exactly what our pilots were experiencing. Over the past 2 years, since Marcus had brought in outside investors and had started pushing for rapid expansion, I'd been noticing concerning patterns. Maintenance schedules being compressed to keep aircraft flying more hours. Pilot rest requirements being calculated to absolute minimums rather than conservative standards. Safety reports being downplayed or dismissed to avoid expensive corrective actions. When I'd raised concerns at board meetings, Marcus had told me I was being overcautious, that I was applying military standards to a civilian operation that needed to be cost competitive. 3 months before Jennifer died in that car accident, a tragedy that was completely random, a drunk driver running a red light. She'd come to me worried about Marcus's decisions at SkyBridge. She'd been the company's chief financial officer and had access to all the financial records. She'd discovered that Marcus was cooking the books, hiding maintenance expenses and pilot overtime costs to make the profit margins look better for the investors. She'd found evidence he was pressuring maintenance supervisors to sign off on aircraft as airworthy when they had documented discrepancies that should have grounded them until repairs were completed. Jennifer had been planning to confront Marcus and to bring the issues to the board, but she'd wanted to gather complete documentation first. Then the accident happened and she was gone, and Marcus had played the grieving husband while quietly destroying the evidence Jennifer had been compiling. I'd found some of her files after her death, hidden in her home office, labeled as personal financial records, but actually containing documentation of Marcus's fraud and safety violations. After Marcus finished his presentation about buying me out, the 3 investors asked a few questions about the transition timeline and the capital restructuring. Then one of them, a venture capital partner named Richard Donovan, asked me directly what I thought about the proposal. I looked at him and said I'd need time to review it with my advisors, but I had serious concerns about the company's current direction and about whether the board was receiving accurate information about operations and safety compliance. Marcus's expression tightened. He said smoothly that every airline faced operational challenges and that he was managing them appropriately. He suggested that my concerns reflected a military mindset that didn't translate well to civilian business, where calculated risks were necessary for competitiveness. Richard Donovan nodded like that made sense, clearly not understanding that calculated risks in aviation meant understanding failure modes and maintaining safety margins, not cutting corners on maintenance and pilot rest. I told the board I'd respond to the buyout proposal within a week, and the meeting ended. Marcus walked me to the door of the conference room and said quietly that he hoped I'd be reasonable about this transition. He tried to structure it in a way that let me exit with dignity and financial security. If I fought him on it, things would get ugly and expensive, and ultimately I'd lose because the investors controlled the majority of the board votes, and they trusted his business leadership. I drove home from that meeting thinking about Jennifer and about how she tried to protect the company from Marcus's recklessness. Thinking about how Marcus had called me just a pilot, reducing 28 years of Air Force command experience to a simple technical skill. Thinking about the pilots and passengers who flew on SkyBridge aircraft every day, trusting that someone was maintaining proper safety standards, not knowing that corners were being cut to make quarterly numbers look better for investors who didn't understand aviation. That evening, I went to my study and pulled out the files Jennifer had hidden. Documentation of maintenance corners being cut, records of pilot fatigue violations, financial statements showing expenses being hidden from the board, evidence that Marcus was running an operation that looked successful on paper but was actually compromising safety in ways that could kill people. I also pulled out my own files from 30 years of military aviation and command experience. My understanding of FAA regulations and NTSB oversight. My contacts with aviation safety inspectors and investigators who'd worked with me during my military career. My knowledge of how aviation accidents happened when organizations prioritized profits over safety. My experience building cases and presenting evidence to senior leadership from my time briefing generals at the Pentagon. Marcus thought he was dealing with an old pilot who didn't understand business. What he didn't understand was that he'd just threatened someone who'd commanded billion-dollar air operations, who'd managed safety programs for thousands of flights, who'd investigated aviation incidents, who understood regulatory compliance at a deep level, and who had 3 decades of experience identifying organizational failures before they caused catastrophic results. I made my first call to Colonel Rhett James Morrison, who'd commanded the Air Force Safety Center before retiring and becoming a consultant for the NTSB. I told him I needed his expertise reviewing safety documentation for a civilian airline that I suspected was cutting corners. James said he'd be happy to help and asked if this was about SkyBridge. Apparently, the aviation safety community was smaller than I'd thought, and there had already been some quiet concerns about SkyBridge's operations. My second call was to Major General Rhett. Patricia Chun, who'd been my commanding officer 20 years ago and had retired as Director of Operations for Air Mobility Command before becoming a consultant for the FAA on safety compliance. I explained the situation and asked if she'd review SkyBridge's operations and provide a professional assessment. Patricia said absolutely, and mentioned that the FAA had received some anonymous complaints about SkyBridge over the past year, but hadn't had enough specific evidence to trigger a formal investigation. My third call was to Lieutenant Colonel Rhett Robert Martinez, who'd been a JAG officer specializing in military aviation law before retiring and joining a civilian firm that handled aviation regulatory compliance. I asked him to review SkyBridge's corporate structure, the investor agreements, and the buyout proposal Marcus had presented. Robert said he'd start immediately and would have a preliminary analysis within 48 hours. Over the next week, I did what I'd spent 28 years doing in the Air Force. I gathered intelligence, I analyzed systems, I identified points of failure, and I prepared a comprehensive plan of action. Marcus thought I was just an old pilot reviewing a buyout offer with an attorney. What I was actually doing was building a case that would either force Marcus out completely or shut down his reckless operation before it killed someone. The campaign was beginning. And in 28 years of military operations, I'd never failed to accomplish a mission once I'd completed my planning and preparation. Marcus was about to learn that commanding combat operations and managing billion-dollar air campaigns had prepared me for exactly this kind of fight. The morning after Marcus's board meeting, I arrived at SkyBridge Aviation's headquarters at 0530, 3 hours before normal business operations began. The facility was a modest complex near the regional airport, hangars, maintenance bays, administrative offices, and a pilot briefing room. I designed the layout myself when we'd founded the company, using principles I'd learned from military air base operations. Every system, every workflow, every safety protocol reflected 3 decades of Air Force aviation experience. I went directly to my office and started pulling files I'd been maintaining over the past 2 years. Safety reports that had been downplayed or dismissed. Maintenance logs showing deferred repairs. Pilot scheduling records indicating rest period violations. Financial documents showing expenses being categorized creatively to hide operational costs. I'd been documenting everything quietly, concerned about the direction Marcus was taking the company, but hoping it wouldn't come to a confrontation. Now I needed that documentation organized and ready for analysis. At 0700, I walked through the maintenance hangar. The morning shift was just starting, and I knew most of the mechanics by name. These were skilled aviation maintenance technicians, several of them former Air Force, who took pride in their work and who understood that lives depended on their attention to detail. I stopped to talk with the maintenance supervisor, a former Air Force Master Sergeant named Mike Johnson, who'd worked for me at 3 different bases during my military career before retiring and joining SkyBridge. Mike asked if we could talk privately. We went to his office, and he closed the door. He told me he was worried about pressure from Marcus to sign off on aircraft with open discrepancies. Nothing catastrophic yet, Mike said, but maintenance was being treated as an inconvenient expense rather than a critical safety function. Marcus had implemented a new metric tracking aircraft utilization rates and was pushing supervisors to minimize downtime. Mike said he'd been resisting the pressure, but 2 of his best technicians had quit in the past month because they were uncomfortable with the direction things were going. I asked Mike if he'd been documenting the pressure and the specific instances where he'd been asked to compromise standards. He said yes. He'd been keeping detailed notes because his FAA certification was on the line if anything went wrong. I told him to continue documenting everything and to maintain his standards regardless of pressure from management. I said things were going to change soon, though I couldn't give him details yet. Mike looked relieved and said he trusted me. We'd worked together long enough that he knew I'd never compromise safety for profit. At 0800, I met with our chief pilot, a former Navy commander named Sarah Rodriguez, who'd flown carriers before retiring and joining the civilian aviation world. Sarah and I had known each other for 20 years, had served on a joint task force together, and had mutual respect built on understanding what military aviation discipline meant. I asked her about pilot morale and whether she was seeing concerning patterns in operations. Sarah didn't hesitate. She said pilot fatigue was becoming a serious issue because scheduling was being pushed to regulatory minimums with no buffer for delays or weather. Several pilots had filed safety reports about being pressured to accept aircraft with maintenance write-ups that should have grounded the plane until repairs were completed. The company's safety culture was deteriorating, Sarah said, because Marcus treated safety concerns as complaints from people who didn't understand business necessity. I asked if she'd documented the specific incidents. Sarah said absolutely. As chief pilot, she was required to maintain records of all safety reports, and she'd been doing it meticulously. She also said something that alarmed me. She'd heard Marcus discussing with the investors the possibility of replacing the entire pilot group with lower-paid contract pilots who wouldn't have the seniority or the willingness to push back on questionable operations. Sarah said if that happened, she'd resign immediately because she wouldn't work for an airline that valued costs over safety. Robert Martinez, my aviation attorney, called at 0900 with his preliminary analysis of the corporate structure and buyout proposal. His findings were interesting. Marcus had structured the investor agreements in a way that gave him disproportionate control despite owning less than the majority of shares. He positioned himself as CEO with broad operational authority and had gotten the investors to agree that board votes on operational matters would defer to management expertise. Essentially, Marcus had given himself near dictatorial control over day-to-day operations while making it appear the board had oversight. Robert said the buyout proposal was structured to trap me. If I sold my shares under the terms Marcus proposed, I'd have no further involvement in the company and no legal standing to raise safety concerns. The non-compete clause would prevent me from starting or joining any competing airline. And the 5-year payment structure meant I'd be financially dependent on SkyBridge's continued operation, giving Marcus leverage to threaten withholding payments if I caused problems. Robert said it was a sophisticated trap disguised as a generous offer. More importantly, Robert had discovered that Marcus had been moving money out of SkyBridge into a separate company he'd created without board knowledge or approval. Over the past 2 years, approximately $800,000 had been transferred to an entity called Web Aviation Consulting for services that were vaguely described in the accounting records. Robert said this looked like embezzlement. Marcus was stealing from the company while telling investors it was profitable. Colonel Rhett James Morrison called with his analysis of the safety documentation I'd sent him. James said he was seriously concerned about what he was seeing. Multiple indicators of an organization that had lost its safety culture. Maintenance discrepancies being deferred for cost reasons rather than safety evaluation. Pilots reporting pressure to accept aircraft they considered unairworthy. Safety reports being treated as complaints rather than important data about system failures. James said he'd seen this pattern before, and it typically preceded serious accidents. James had identified 3 specific aircraft in SkyBridge's fleet that had concerning maintenance histories. All 3 had recurring discrepancies that suggested underlying problems that weren't being properly diagnosed or repaired. One aircraft had a history of pressurization issues that kept being signed off as fixed but kept recurring. That suggested a structural problem that needed comprehensive inspection, not just repeated patching. James said if one of those aircraft had a catastrophic failure in flight, the subsequent investigation would reveal the maintenance corners that had been cut, and everyone with oversight responsibility would face potential criminal liability. Major General Rep Patricia Chun called that afternoon. She'd been doing some research into SkyBridge's operations through her FAA contacts. There had been 3 anonymous safety complaints filed about SkyBridge over the past 18 months. One from a pilot reporting fatigue violations. One from a maintenance technician reporting pressure to falsify inspection records. One from a flight attendant reporting concerns about pilots flying while fatigued. None of the complaints had included enough specific information to trigger a formal investigation, but they'd raised flags within the FAA's Safety Oversight Office. Patricia said the FAA was now very interested in taking a closer look at SkyBridge, particularly after she'd shared some of the documentation I'd provided. She'd spoken with a flight standards inspector who was prepared to conduct a detailed audit of SkyBridge's operations, maintenance, and training programs. If the audit found violations of federal aviation regulations, SkyBridge could face fines, operational restrictions, or even suspension of its operating certificate. Patricia also mentioned something concerning. She discovered that Marcus had been shopping SkyBridge to larger regional airlines as a potential acquisition target. He'd been presenting the company as more profitable than it actually was by hiding maintenance costs and by projecting unrealistic revenue growth. If a sale went through based on fraudulent financial information, Marcus would cash out for millions while leaving the acquiring company with an airline that had deferred maintenance, safety violations, and potential FAA enforcement actions. Over the next week, I continued gathering evidence while carefully monitoring Marcus's actions. He'd apparently interpreted my silence as capitulation and had become more aggressive in pushing his agenda. He'd announced to the staff that there would be a leadership transition soon and that the company would be implementing new efficiency measures. Several longtime employees came to me privately asking what was happening and whether the company was in trouble. I told them honestly that changes were coming, but not the changes Marcus was planning. I asked them to continue doing their jobs professionally and maintaining safety standards regardless of any pressure from management. I told them to document everything, particularly any instances where they were asked to compromise safety or to falsify records. Most of them had military backgrounds and understood what I was really saying. Hold your positions, maintain your standards, and gather evidence because a reckoning was coming. Mike Johnson, the maintenance supervisor, came to me with something disturbing. He'd been going through maintenance records for the 3 aircraft James Morrison had flagged as concerning, and he'd discovered that someone had altered the computer records to make it appear that certain inspections had been completed when they actually hadn't been done. The alterations had been made from Marcus's office computer using his login credentials. Mike said altering maintenance records was a federal crime that could result in both FAA certificate revocation and criminal prosecution. I asked Mike to preserve all evidence of the alterations and to document exactly what had been changed and when. Mike said he'd already made backup copies of everything and had stored them securely off-site. He also said he'd contacted the FAA anonymously to report the falsified records because his own mechanic certificate was at risk if he knew about fraudulent documentation and didn't report it. Sarah Rodriguez came to me with pilot reports documenting specific instances of being pressured to fly aircraft with open maintenance write-ups. She had written statements from 4 different pilots describing situations where Marcus had personally told them to accept aircraft over their safety objections, threatening their employment if they refused to cooperate. Sarah said she'd advised all the pilots to file NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System reports, which provided legal protection for people reporting safety violations. Robert Martinez called with more findings about Marcus's financial fraud. The $800,000 transferred to Web Aviation Consulting was just the beginning. Robert had found evidence of additional schemes where Marcus was billing SkyBridge for services never provided, creating fake vendor relationships with companies he controlled, and manipulating expense reports. The total fraud appeared to exceed $1.2 million over 2 years. Robert said this was criminal embezzlement and securities fraud, since Marcus had been providing false financial information to investors. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive dossier: safety violations, maintenance fraud, pilot fatigue violations, financial embezzlement, false statements to investors, and evidence that Marcus was planning to sell the company based on fraudulent financial information. I had documented evidence from multiple independent sources, expert analysis from retired flag officers with aviation expertise, and statements from employees willing to testify about the pressure to compromise safety. But before making any moves, I needed to understand the timing. Marcus was clearly moving toward forcing me out and potentially selling the company. I needed to act before either of those things happened, but I also needed to ensure I had all the evidence properly documented and that I'd positioned everything correctly for maximum impact. Sarah Rodriguez called me one evening at home. She said she'd overheard Marcus on a conference call with the investors discussing a sale timeline. Marcus was telling them he expected to have a deal with a larger regional airline within 3 months, with a valuation that would give investors a 4 times return on their money. He was describing my buyout as already agreed to in principle, just waiting for documentation to be finalized. Sarah said Marcus was lying to the investors and was probably planning to use the buyout agreement to force me out quickly so I wouldn't be in a position to interfere with the sale. I thanked Sarah and told her to be ready for some dramatic changes very soon. Then I made a decision about timing. I needed to move now, before Marcus could either force me out or complete a sale. I called Robert Martinez and told him to prepare a lawsuit against Marcus personally and against SkyBridge's board for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and violations of aviation safety regulations. I told him to prepare complaints to file with the FAA, the FBI, and the Securities and Exchange Commission about Marcus's various criminal activities. I also called Patricia Chun and told her the FAA should launch their formal investigation of SkyBridge immediately. I'd provide them with comprehensive documentation showing safety violations, maintenance fraud, and financial crimes. Patricia said the FAA inspector was ready to move and would be issuing a notification to SkyBridge within 24 hours that they were under formal investigation. Marcus had spent 2 weeks thinking I was reviewing his buyout offer and preparing to accept my exit from the company. What I'd actually been doing was building a comprehensive case that would either force him out completely or shut down his entire operation before his recklessness killed someone. He'd called me just a pilot and had assumed I didn't understand complex business operations or regulatory compliance. He was about to learn that commanding air bases, managing billion-dollar aviation operations, and planning strategic air campaigns had prepared me to dismantle his fraudulent house of cards with precision and overwhelming force. The preliminary operations were complete. Now came the decisive engagement. The FAA notification arrived at SkyBridge Aviation headquarters on a Tuesday morning via certified mail and email simultaneously. Principal Operations Inspector David Walsh from the Flight Standards District Office formally notified the company that based on information received, the FAA was initiating a comprehensive inspection of SkyBridge's operations, maintenance, and training programs under 14 CFR Part 121. The inspection would begin in 72 hours and would include examination of all records, interviews with personnel, and detailed review of aircraft maintenance status. The notification also stated that based on preliminary information, certain aircraft might be grounded pending detailed inspection. Marcus called me within 30 minutes of receiving the notification, his voice tight, with barely controlled panic. He demanded to know if I'd reported the company to the FAA. I told him calmly that I'd shared safety concerns with aviation safety professionals, as was my responsibility under FAA regulations. Any pilot, mechanic, or company officer who becomes aware of potential safety violations has an obligation to report them. Marcus said I was sabotaging the company out of spite because I was angry about the buyout proposal. I told him that if there was nothing to hide, the FAA inspection would find everything in order and operations could continue normally. Marcus said the timing was suspicious. He'd just told the investors we were close to a sale agreement, and now suddenly the FAA was launching an investigation. I asked if he'd considered that the FAA might have received reports from multiple sources, not just me. Pilots file safety reports. Mechanics file safety reports. Anonymous complaints get submitted. If multiple people were concerned enough to report safety issues, that suggested real problems, not a conspiracy against him. The call ended with Marcus threatening legal action against me for tortious interference with business relationships and for violating my fiduciary duty as a board member. I told him calmly that he should consult with his attorney about whether board members have a duty to report safety violations and financial fraud. Then I hung up. 72 hours later, the FAA inspection team arrived. 5 inspectors led by David Walsh, each with specific expertise in operations, maintenance, training, or safety management systems. They set up in SkyBridge's conference room and began their systematic examination. They pulled maintenance records for every aircraft in the fleet. They interviewed pilots, mechanics, and operations personnel. They examined training records and operational procedures. They reviewed safety reports and incident documentation. And they found exactly what I'd known they'd find: a pattern of safety violations, deferred maintenance, falsified records, and an organizational culture that prioritized profits over safety. By the end of the second day of inspection, the FAA had grounded 3 aircraft pending detailed structural inspections. These were the same 3 aircraft that James Morrison had flagged as concerning based on their maintenance histories. Inspector Walsh told Marcus that the maintenance records for these aircraft showed patterns of repeated discrepancies that suggested underlying problems that had never been properly diagnosed or repaired. The aircraft would remain grounded until comprehensive inspections were completed by independent maintenance facilities at the company's expense. Marcus exploded, demanding to know what authority the FAA had to ground his aircraft without proof of actual safety problems. Walsh explained patiently that the FAA had broad authority to ground aircraft when inspectors had reasonable concern about airworthiness. The maintenance records showed repeated repairs for the same problems, which suggested inadequate troubleshooting and repair. Additionally, the FAA had found evidence that some maintenance records had been altered electronically, which was itself a serious violation regardless of what the alterations were hiding. Walsh also informed Marcus that the FAA was referring several findings to the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General for potential criminal investigation. Specifically, evidence of falsified maintenance records and potential false statements in documentation submitted to the FAA. Walsh said these were federal crimes that could result in both civil penalties and criminal prosecution. The investors held an emergency board meeting that evening. Marcus, the three outside investors, and me. The investors were furious, demanding to know how the company had gone from being a promising acquisition target to being under FAA investigation in a matter of days. Marcus tried to blame me, claiming I'd made false reports to the FAA because I was unhappy about the leadership transition. He said I was trying to destroy the company out of spite. I let Marcus finish his accusations. Then I opened my briefcase and started laying out documentation on the conference table. Safety reports filed by pilots and mechanics showing a pattern of pressure to compromise standards. Maintenance records showing deferred repairs and recurring discrepancies. Financial records showing the transfers to Web Aviation Consulting and other entities Marcus controlled. Evidence that maintenance records had been altered using Marcus's computer login. Pilot statements documenting specific instances where Marcus had pressured them to accept unairworthy aircraft. Richard Donovan, the lead investor, looked at the documentation and his face went pale. He asked if this was all real. I told him it was completely real, that I'd had it reviewed by experts including a retired Air Force Safety Center commander and a former FAA director of operations, and that the FAA's investigation would confirm everything I was showing them. I said the company they'd invested in wasn't a well-run airline with growth potential. It was a fraud scheme where Marcus had been cutting safety corners to inflate profits while embezzling money through fake consulting contracts. Marcus started to object, but Donovan cut him off. Donovan said as the lead investor, he wanted an independent forensic audit of the company's finances immediately. He also wanted Marcus suspended from operational authority pending investigation. The other two investors agreed. Marcus argued that suspending him would paralyze the company, but Donovan said the alternative was continuing with someone who'd apparently been committing fraud and endangering passengers. I proposed that as the co-founder and the board member with actual aviation operations experience, I should assume operational control immediately while the forensic audit was conducted. I had the necessary credentials. I held an ADP license. I had decades of aviation command experience, and I understood both FAA regulations and airline operations. Donovan agreed immediately. The other investors agreed. Marcus was suspended from all operational authority, stripped of his access to company systems, and told to make himself available for the forensic audit. Marcus stood up, his face red with rage. He said I'd engineered a coup, that I'd manipulated the investors, that I'd destroyed everything he'd built. I told him calmly that I'd exposed a fraud he'd been perpetrating and prevented what would likely have become a fatal accident when one of those improperly maintained aircraft failed in flight. I said if he'd built something real rather than something based on corners cut and records falsified, there'd have been nothing to expose. The next morning, I took operational control of SkyBridge Aviation. My first action was to bring Mike Johnson and Sarah Rodriguez into my office and tell them they had complete authority to ground any aircraft they had safety concerns about, regardless of business impact. I told them we were going to fix everything that had been wrong, properly fund maintenance and training, and rebuild a safety culture. Both of them looked relieved and said they'd been waiting for this. We conducted a comprehensive review of the entire fleet. The 3 aircraft already grounded by the FAA and needed extensive structural repairs that would take weeks. 2 other aircraft had significant deferred maintenance that required immediate attention. We grounded those aircraft voluntarily and brought in outside maintenance contractors to do the work properly. Yes, it was expensive. Yes, it reduced our operational capacity. But it was necessary to ensure safety and to demonstrate to the FAA that we were serious about fixing the problems. I met with every pilot personally. I told them the pressure to compromise safety was over. They should refuse any aircraft they had concerns about, report any safety issues immediately, and never accept pressure to fly when they were fatigued or when an aircraft had discrepancies they weren't comfortable with. Several pilots said it felt like the old days when we'd first started the company and safety had been the priority. The forensic audit results came back 3 weeks later. Marcus had embezzled $1.4 million over 2 years through fake consulting contracts, inflated expenses, and transfers to entities he controlled. He'd also hidden approximately $600,000 in legitimate maintenance expenses by categorizing them incorrectly, making the company appear more profitable than it actually was. The financial statements he'd been providing to investors were fraudulent, overstating profits by approximately 40%. Robert Martinez filed lawsuits on behalf of the company and the investors against Marcus personally. We sued for the embezzled funds, for fraud, for breach of fiduciary duty, and for damages caused by his mismanagement. We also filed criminal complaints with the FBI for wire fraud and with the FAA for falsifying aviation maintenance records. The larger regional airline that had been negotiating to acquire SkyBridge withdrew from discussions immediately when they learned about the FAA investigation and the financial fraud. They'd been planning to pay $20 million for a company they now realized was worth a fraction of that and came with massive legal and regulatory liabilities. Marcus's dream of cashing out for millions evaporated. 2 months after I took operational control, the FAA completed their inspection. Their findings were extensive, multiple violations of federal aviation regulations related to maintenance, operations, and safety management. SkyBridge was fined $375,000 in civil penalties. We were also required to implement a comprehensive corrective action plan under FAA oversight, which would take 6 months and cost an additional $200,000. But the FAA didn't revoke our operating certificate. Inspector Walsh told me that the decisive factor was that the organization had immediately taken corrective action once the problems were exposed, had grounded aircraft voluntarily, had cooperated fully with the investigation, and had put someone with credible aviation safety experience in charge of operations. Walsh said if Marcus had still been running the company, the outcome would likely have been certificate revocation. The investors had another board meeting. Donovan said they needed to restructure ownership. Marcus would be forced to sell his shares for essentially nothing. The lawsuits and criminal charges meant his ownership was worthless and created liability for everyone else. The investors wanted to know if I'd be willing to buy out their shares and take majority control of the company, with the understanding that rebuilding would take time and they wouldn't see returns for several years. I agreed, with conditions. The company would be restructured with safety as the absolute priority. We'd maintain conservative financial management, proper maintenance funding, and appropriate staffing levels. We'd never compromise safety for profit. We'd build the company the right way, the way I'd learned during 28 years of military aviation, where cutting corners could kill people and destroy million-dollar aircraft. The investors agreed. Over the next 3 months, I bought out their shares for approximately 60 cents on the dollar. They took losses on their investment, but got out before potential criminal liability attached. I became the sole owner of SkyBridge Aviation, a company I'd co-founded and that Marcus had nearly destroyed through fraud and recklessness. 6 months after the FAA investigation began, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Marcus. Wire fraud, falsifying aviation maintenance records, making false statements to the FAA, and securities fraud for lying to investors. Marcus pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperating with the investigation. He received 30 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, and was ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution, though his bankruptcy meant actual collection would be minimal. Marcus's commercial pilot license was permanently revoked by the FAA. He was banned from serving as an officer or director of any aviation company. His criminal record meant he'd never work in the aviation industry again. The man who'd called me just a pilot and had tried to force me out of the company I'd founded was now a convicted felon whose career was permanently destroyed. A year after I took operational control, SkyBridge Aviation had completed the FAA's corrective action plan and was operating under normal oversight rather than enhanced surveillance. The fleet was properly maintained. The pilots were well-rested and properly trained. The safety culture was strong. Revenue was lower than it had been under Marcus's artificially inflated numbers, but the company was actually profitable on an honest accounting basis. I hired a former Air Force Operations Group commander as Chief Operating Officer to handle day-to-day operations while I focused on strategic direction and safety oversight. I brought in a former Navy maintenance officer to run the maintenance program. I promoted Sarah Rodriguez to Vice President of Operations. I built a team of professionals who understood that aviation safety wasn't an expense to be minimized, but a requirement to be maintained at any cost. We were smaller than Marcus had claimed we'd become, but we were sustainable and safe. We had loyal customers who appreciated reliable service from an airline that valued safety. We had employees who took pride in their work because they knew they weren't being asked to compromise standards. We had the respect of the FAA inspectors who'd once investigated us, but now saw an organization committed to doing things right. I stood in the maintenance hangar one evening, watching mechanics perform a detailed inspection on one of our aircraft. They were taking their time, doing it properly, not cutting corners. Mike Johnson was supervising, making notes on his tablet, ensuring everything was documented correctly. This was what aviation maintenance was supposed to look like, skilled professionals doing careful work because lives depended on it. Marcus had called me just a pilot and had thought my military experience was irrelevant to running a civilian airline. He'd thought his MBA and his business acumen made him superior to someone who'd spent a career in uniform. He'd never understood that commanding air bases and managing billion-dollar aviation operations had prepared me for exactly this kind of challenge. He'd learned the hard way that military aviation experience wasn't just about flying planes. It was about understanding systems, maintaining safety cultures, managing complex operations, and knowing that shortcuts kill people. He'd tried to force me out of a company I'd founded, and instead I'd exposed his fraud, taken complete control, and rebuilt the operation properly while he went to prison. The old pilot, as Marcus had dismissively called me, had just commanded an operation that destroyed Marcus's career and saved an airline from the catastrophic accident his recklessness would eventually have caused. 28 years of Air Force command experience had prepared me for exactly this mission. 3 years after taking sole control of SkyBridge Aviation, I stood on the tarmac watching one of our aircraft push back from the gate for an evening departure to Atlanta. The Boeing 737 gleamed under the terminal lights, freshly painted with our updated livery that still carried the SkyBridge name, but now included a subtle Air Force star on the tail, a reminder of the company's commitment to military-grade safety standards. Captain Jennifer Morrison, one of our senior pilots and a former Air Force C-130 pilot, was at the controls. Her crew had completed their pre-flight with the thoroughness I'd come to expect from every SkyBridge employee. No corners cut, no pressure to rush, just professional aviation operations done exactly right. The transformation of SkyBridge over those 3 years had been comprehensive and often painful. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's criminal prosecution and my takeover had been financially brutal. We'd operated at a loss for the first 8 months while completing the FAA's corrective action plan, repairing or replacing aircraft that had been inadequately maintained, and rebuilding our reputation with customers who'd been understandably concerned about an airline that had been under federal investigation. But the foundation was solid now because it was built on integrity rather than fraud. Our on-time performance was the best among regional carriers in our market. Our safety record was unblemished, not a single incident or accident in 3 years of operations under proper management. Our employee retention was exceptional because people wanted to work for a company that valued their professionalism and never asked them to compromise their standards. Our customer satisfaction scores were climbing steadily because passengers could sense the difference between an airline that cared about safety and one that just cared about profits. The financial recovery had been steady rather than spectacular. We'd never returned to the artificially inflated profit margins Marcus had claimed while cutting corners and hiding expenses. But honest profits built on sustainable operations were better than fraudulent numbers that would eventually collapse into catastrophe. We'd paid off the FAA fines. We'd completed all the required corrective actions. We'd invested in proper maintenance equipment and training programs. We were smaller than Marcus had envisioned, operating 12 aircraft instead of the 20 he'd planned. But every one of our aircraft was properly maintained, and every flight was operated safely. The regulatory relationship with the FAA had evolved from adversarial investigation to collaborative oversight. Inspector David Walsh, who'd led the initial investigation, had told me privately that SkyBridge was now viewed within the FAA as an example of how an organization could recover from serious safety violations through genuine commitment to corrective action. Several other airlines had been referred to our safety management system as a model for how to build a strong safety culture. Walsh said the transformation was remarkable and reflected leadership that actually understood aviation safety rather than just paying it lip service. I'd also taken steps to ensure what happened under Marcus's leadership could never happen again. I'd restructured the company's board to include independent directors with aviation safety backgrounds, a former NTSB board member, a retired airline CEO known for safety advocacy, and a professor of aviation safety from a major university. I'd implemented a safety management system that encouraged employees at all levels to report concerns without fear of retaliation. I'd established financial controls that required independent audits and prevented any single person from having the kind of unchecked authority Marcus had abused. More importantly, I'd rebuilt relationships with the military aviation community and had created a pipeline for transitioning military pilots and maintenance personnel to join SkyBridge after their service. We actively recruited from the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, offering competitive pay and emphasizing our commitment to the kind of safety culture military aviators understood. Over half our pilots were now military veterans, and they brought with them the discipline and professionalism that military aviation demanded. Our maintenance department was similarly staffed with former military technicians who'd been trained to treat every aircraft like lives depended on it, because they did. The criminal case against Marcus had concluded 18 months after charges were filed. He'd served his 30-month federal prison sentence and had been released on supervised probation. I'd heard through industry contacts that he'd tried to find work in aviation consulting or business management, but his criminal record and his reputation meant no one would hire him. He'd eventually taken a job managing a car rental franchise, a dramatic fall from the airline CEO position he'd held and the millions he'd planned to make from selling SkyBridge. The civil lawsuits had been more successful in terms of recovery. Marcus had been required to liquidate his assets, his house, his cars, his investment accounts, to pay restitution. The bankruptcy court had recovered approximately $800,000, which had been distributed among the company and the investors he'd defrauded. It wasn't full restitution for the $1.4 million he'd stolen, but it was something. More importantly, it had sent a clear message that aviation fraud had real consequences. I'd used Jennifer's life insurance money, the payout from her death that Marcus had probably been counting on, to establish the Jennifer Webb Callahan Aviation Safety Foundation. The foundation provided scholarships for students pursuing aviation careers who demonstrated both technical excellence and commitment to safety. It also funded research into aviation safety culture and human factors, and it provided grants to organizations working to improve safety in general aviation. The foundation was Jennifer's legacy, using money that had come from her death to potentially save lives in the future. The first scholarship recipient had been a young woman from a military family who'd written her application essay about watching her father, an Air Force pilot, make difficult decisions that prioritized safety over mission completion and wanting to bring that same mindset to civilian aviation. She was now a first officer at SkyBridge, flying the same routes her scholarship had helped her train for, and she was exactly the kind of safety-focused professional we wanted representing our company. Mike Johnson, the maintenance supervisor who'd stood firm against Marcus's pressure and had documented everything, was now our director of maintenance. He'd built a maintenance organization that other airlines studied as an example of how to do things right. Mike had also testified at an FAA safety conference about the importance of maintenance personnel standing firm against pressure to compromise standards, and his presentation had been so well received that he now traveled regularly to speak to aviation maintenance organizations about safety culture. Sarah Rodriguez, the former Navy commander who'd served as chief pilot and had refused to bow to Marcus's pressure, was now our vice president of flight operations. She developed training programs that emphasized decision-making under pressure and the authority and responsibility of pilots to refuse aircraft they deemed unairworthy. Sarah had also served on an FAA advisory committee that developed new regulations around pilot fatigue management, drawing on her experience with Marcus's scheduling abuses to help create better protections for all airline pilots. The employees who'd stood with me during the crisis, who'd documented safety violations, who'd filed reports despite pressure, who'd maintained their professional standards when it would have been easier to go along with Marcus's cost-cutting, had been rewarded with positions of increased responsibility and with the satisfaction of working for a company that valued their integrity. I'd made sure everyone knew that the turnaround couldn't have happened without people who'd been willing to do the right thing even when it was difficult. I'd also maintained my own flying proficiency, taking the controls regularly on scheduled flights to stay current and to demonstrate that leadership in aviation meant understanding operations from the flight deck, not just from an office. I still held my ADP license and all my type ratings. At 67, I was probably the oldest actively flying airline captain in the region, but my FAA medical was current and my skills were sharp. Flying reminded me why safety mattered, because up at 35,000 feet with 100 passengers behind you, there's no room for the kind of shortcuts Marcus had been taking. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. It was Richard Donovan, the lead investor who'd lost money when I'd bought out the investor's shares after the crisis. Donovan said he'd been following SkyBridge's recovery and was impressed with what I'd accomplished. He said he'd initially been angry about losing money on the investment, but he'd come to realize that Marcus had defrauded everyone and that I'd saved them from what would have been total loss if an accident had occurred. Donovan said he'd learned an important lesson about the difference between financial metrics that look good on paper and real operational excellence, and he'd changed how his venture capital firm evaluated potential investments in technical industries. Donovan asked if SkyBridge had any interest in taking on investment capital for expansion now that operations were stable and profitable. I told him honestly that I wasn't interested in outside investors. SkyBridge would grow organically at a pace that allowed us to maintain our safety culture and our financial stability. Donovan said he understood and respected that decision. Then he asked if I'd be willing to serve as an advisor to his firm on aviation investments, helping them evaluate the operational and safety aspects of airline companies they were considering investing in. I agreed to that. It was an opportunity to spread the lessons learned from SkyBridge's experience and potentially prevent other airlines from making Marcus's mistakes. I'd also been asked to serve on several aviation safety boards and advisory committees. The Flight Safety Foundation had invited me to join their board of governors. The NTSB had asked me to serve on an advisory committee examining organizational factors in aviation accidents. The Air Force had invited me to speak at the Air War College about translating military aviation safety culture to civilian operations. Each of these opportunities was a chance to share what I'd learned from both my military career and from rebuilding SkyBridge, potentially improving safety across the entire aviation industry. For years after taking control of SkyBridge, we achieved a milestone that felt more meaningful than any financial metric. The FAA returned us to normal oversight, officially ending the enhanced surveillance that had been in place since the investigation. Inspector Walsh attended a small ceremony at our headquarters where he formally presented a letter confirming SkyBridge had completed all corrective actions and had demonstrated sustained commitment to safety. Walsh said in his 30 years as an FAA inspector, he'd rarely seen such a comprehensive transformation of an airline safety culture. That evening, I gathered all SkyBridge employees, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, dispatchers, operations staff, everyone, in our largest hangar for a company meeting. I stood in front of a 737 and talked to them about what we'd accomplished together. I told them about the dark days when the company had been under investigation, when our future had been uncertain, when people had questioned whether we'd survive. I told them about the hard work everyone had done to fix the problems, to rebuild our reputation, to prove we were worthy of passengers' trust. But most importantly, I told them about the culture we'd built, a culture where safety wasn't just a slogan, but a genuine value that guided every decision. A culture where anyone could raise a concern without fear of retaliation. A culture where we'd rather cancel a flight than compromise safety. A culture where professionalism was respected and corners were never cut. I told them that this culture was our greatest asset, more valuable than our aircraft or our routes or our financial reserves, and that maintaining it was everyone's responsibility. The applause from the employees was genuine and sustained. These were professionals who took pride in their work and who appreciated working for a company that valued their expertise. After the meeting, dozens of people came up to tell me stories about times they'd felt pressured at previous airlines to compromise standards and how different SkyBridge felt. Several said they'd turned down higher-paying jobs at larger airlines because they wanted to work somewhere they could be proud of. I'm Thomas Callahan, 70 years old now. I'm a retired Air Force colonel who spent 28 years commanding aviation operations worth billions of dollars and learning that safety culture is built through leadership that understands operations, not through business school theories about efficiency. I'm a father who lost his daughter, but who honored her memory by preventing the aviation disaster her husband's fraud and recklessness would eventually have caused. Marcus Webb called me just a pilot and tried to force me out of the company I'd founded, dismissing my military command experience as irrelevant to civilian aviation business. He thought his MBA and his business consulting background made him superior to someone who'd spent a career in uniform. He cut corners on safety to inflate profits, embezzled money to fund his lifestyle, falsified records to hide his incompetence, and nearly killed people through his reckless disregard for aviation safety principles. He learned that commanding air bases, managing complex aviation operations, planning strategic air campaigns, and understanding safety systems from decades of military experience had prepared me to recognize his fraud, dismantle his schemes, and rebuild the company properly. He went to federal prison while I rebuilt SkyBridge into an airline that actually deserved passengers' trust. To anyone facing similar situations, someone dismissing your military experience as irrelevant to civilian business, someone cutting corners you know are dangerous, someone prioritizing profits over principles you understand matter. Remember this: military experience in technical fields isn't just about the specific technical skills. It's about understanding systems, maintaining standards under pressure, leading organizations through challenges, and knowing that some things are more important than short-term profits. Marcus thought Air Force command experience was just about flying planes and following orders. He didn't understand that commanding a bomber wing or managing an air base or planning combat operations meant understanding safety systems, managing complex logistics, making decisions where lives hung in the balance, and building cultures where professionalism and integrity mattered more than convenience. Stand your ground when you see something wrong. Use your experience and your training. Build alliances with professionals who share your values. Document everything meticulously. And when you have to act decisively with overwhelming evidence and clear purpose. That's how you win these battles. Not through anger or confrontation, but through systematic preparation and professional execution. SkyBridge Aviation is thriving now because it's built on the foundation I learned to build during 28 years in the Air Force: solid, honest, professional, safe. Marcus's fraudulent house of cards collapsed because it was built on lies and shortcuts and greed. The old pilot, as he dismissively called me, is still flying, still leading, still proving that military aviation experience translates perfectly to civilian operations when applied with integrity. 28 years of Air Force service taught me many things, but the most important was this: safety isn't expensive, it's priceless. Cutting corners might save money in the short term, but eventually those corners catch up with you. And in aviation, that usually means people die. I've spent the years since rebuilding SkyBridge proving that you can run a profitable airline without compromising safety, that you can compete in a tough market without cutting corners, and that military standards of professionalism and integrity can thrive in civilian business. This is Colonel Thomas Callahan, United States Air Force, signing off. To my fellow military aviators transitioning to civilian aviation, your experience matters more than civilian executives might understand. Your training in safety culture, your understanding of systems, your commitment to professionalism, and your willingness to make hard decisions that prioritize safety over convenience are exactly what civilian aviation needs. Don't let anyone tell you that military experience doesn't translate. It translates perfectly when you have the courage to stand firm on the principles you learned in uniform. Fly safe. Lead with integrity. Build to last. That's the Air Force way, and it's the only way worth flying.